Late 1340s, the Black Death swept across medieval Europe, wreaking terrible havoc upon European populations, as villages, towns, and cities suddenly found themselves bereft of human life. In this video, we'll be looking at the catastrophe through the eyes of those who lived it, citing contemporary sources. Unlike my usual biographical videos, I will be intentionally limiting my own opinions and instead focus on expanding details provided by the chroniclers used. The reason for this is to hopefully allow the viewer to gain a better grasp of how people were affected at the time without a modern perspective interfering in their narrative too much. We begin with an Italian writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, who described the outbreak and its terrible wrath on the city of Florence as the people there struggled to come to terms with the pestilence that had befallen them. Giovanni wrote, "Some say it descended upon the human race through the influence of the heavenly bodies, others that it was a punishment underlying God's righteous anger at our own iniquitous way of life. But whatever it came from, it had originated some years earlier in the East, where it had claimed countless lives before it unhappily spread westward, gaining in strength as it swept from one place to the next." As Giovanni said, it had been in the East where the plague found its beginnings. It had struck even the might of the Mongols, who had been laying siege to Kafar. Despite the dire nature of the outbreak, the Mongol army still saw an opportunity to inflict similar damage on their enemy, lobbing the disease-ridden corpses of their deceased over Kafar's walls, causing the plague to spread further and quicker. Genoese merchantmen had been in the region at the time, and they unwittingly brought the disease home with them. Giovanni continued, outlining the steps that were taken by the leading men of Florence, desperate to contain the outbreak. He wrote, "Large quantities of refuse was cleared out of the city by officials specifically appointed for the purpose, while all sick persons were refused entry into Florence. Numerous other instructions were issued to safeguard the people's health, but all to no avail. At times like these, people found different ways of coping. Most turned to God for comfort, whilst others turned to drink, and there were those who hoped to outrun the plague by shutting themselves away with friends and relatives and enough food and drink to last." Boccaccio continues his narrative by describing the symptoms of the Black Death and the differences in how it affected Westerners and the Mongols in the East. It did not take the form it assumed in the East, where if anyone bled from the nose, it was an obvious portent of certain death. On the contrary, its earliest symptoms in men and women alike was the appearance of swellings in the groin or of the armpit, some of which were egg-shaped, whilst others were roughly the size of the common apple. From there, it would begin to spread and would appear at random all over the body. Later on, the symptoms began to change, and many victims found dark blotches and bruises on their arms, thighs, and other parts of their body. These, to anyone unfortunate enough to find them, was an infallible sign that he would die. At this time, the papacy found itself residing at Avignon, and Avignon was affected terribly by the outbreak, as detailed by one Flemish cleric, who wrote, "At least half the people in Avignon died, for within the walls of the city there are now more than 7,000 houses where no one lives, as everyone inside them has died, and in the suburbs one might imagine there is not one survivor. Therefore the Pope, Clement VI, bought a field near Notre Dame des Miracles, and consecrated it as a cemetery." The scenes in Avignon were repeated across Europe. Scarcely enough survivors lived to bury the dead, and those who did the job, of course, bore the very real risk of becoming infected themselves. Naturally, the very rich would leave this most grim of jobs to the poor who needed the money, whilst the rich themselves escaped to some distant country estate where they could realistically expect to be out of harm's way. The outbreak of the Black Death saw an increase in flagellation, which the same Flemish cleric describes. It was said there attended some 2,000 men and women, many barefoot, others wearing hair shirts or smeared with ashes. As they processed with lamentations and tears, they beat themselves with cruel whips, and their blood ran. The Pope himself took part in some of these processions. The peculiarity of these acts of religious devotion shows the lengths people were willing to go to in the search for answers in these dark, strange, and deeply unsettling times. Whilst ignorance was, of course, understandable, what was not excusable was the all too easy remedy of scapegoating the Jews. Accused of poisoning wells, scores of innocent Jewish people were burned alive as Christians avoided drinking water from wells for fear of becoming infected, and spices were too avoided for fear that they had been delivered on the same Italian ships that brought the plague to Europe. Spices would only be used if they predated the outbreak. Gilles de Moussis, a Benedictine abbot, elaborates further on the atrocities directed at Jewish people across Europe. Across kingdoms and countries where they were to be found, he wrote, Jews were all arrested and charged, and many denied the accusation, but others confirmed it had been their intention to poison the well. Throughout Germany and other countries, they were burned or beheaded or killed by some other means. It has to be said, it doesn't take a genius to work out that those Jewish men and women who confessed had done so under torture. Fear and ignorance makes humans do strange and sometimes terrible things, and in medieval Europe, too often it was the Jews who paid the price. For many chroniclers, like Henry Knighton, it was the pride of men that had brought about God's vengeance. Knighton, in particular, sneered at the ostentatious behaviour of knights and ladies at tournaments, accusing them of turning their backs on God. Another anonymous chronicler wrote, ever since the arrival of the Hainaulters in England, following the marriage of Philippa of Hainault to Edward III, the English have been madly following outlandish ways, changing their grotesque fashions of clothing yearly. They have abandoned the old decent style of long, full garments for clothes which are short, tight, and impractical. The sin of pride manifested itself in this way must surely bring misfortune in the future. To us, it may seem ridiculous blaming a natural disaster on tournaments or fashion, but clearly some viewed European society as becoming corrupted, and for them, as God fearing people, the plague had only been a natural conclusion.